Okay, it's 8 o'clock, and thank you everybody for joining us in the middle of the week and the evening. And I think that we're gonna have a really interesting conversation. We actually didn't even start, and just like in the last couple of minutes before we started, we were bouncing ideas, and I'm dying to just jump into this conversation. But before we jump into this conversation, a few introductions. So my name is Yair, and I'm based here around Philadelphia. So I work with several organizations. One of these organizations is Hope for Israel Alliance. Hope for Israel Alliance is a big group of people, mostly Israelis, but also Americans, Jews, and from all over the world. And we have presence in most of the countries in the United States, Canada, in South America, and most of the countries in Europe, New Zealand, Australia, etc. And all that we're doing in this organization is we're trying to fight anti-Semitism in any way we can, to support Israel and support the democracy in Israel, and do whatever we need to do to bring them home now. So it's really important. You've seen, all these stories of the hostages that just came back. I shared on some of the groups the story of Eli Sharabi, which if you haven't watched yet, you should watch it. It's unbelievable. His story, his testimony from the 500 days in hell. Also, the other organization that I work with is the American Jewish Medical Association, which is a big organization, not only of doctors, but basically any healthcare providers, social workers, nurses, physical therapists, psychologists, dentists, et cetera, trainees, students. And we're trying to basically work together and recognize that we can't tolerate anti-Semitism, any anti-Semitism in healthcare. It's dangerous for our colleagues. It's dangerous for us. It's dangerous, so dangerous for the most valuable thing, which is our patients. So with that, I just wanted to introduce Jason, and Jason is going to introduce Claire and Jonathan. And we're going to start having a conversation about what's happening on campuses, anti-Semitism, legal aspects, the war, and it's going to be an interesting conversation. So I have to share something with you, which is kind of, I don't know if it's going to work to share screen, because just yesterday, Jason shared with me his bio, and as the director of JCRC of Greater Philadelphia. And literally in the last couple of hours, I found out, and he found out about this. Jason Holtzman has been promoted to the position of chief of the Jewish Community Relationship or Relations Council. And that's I don't know all the details, but it's a really big promotion, and it's a really big deal. He's going to be part of the most senior leadership of Greater Philadelphia Federation, and it's really awesome. And I'm, congratulations, Jason. He's a friend and amazing person. And, under his leadership, JCRC really has been taking a huge part of fighting anti-Semitism since October 7th. Jason has been spearheading the Federation and JCRC to combat anti-Semitism, fight, and support Israel in any way that he can. He has a coalition, and he's working with so many people from different organizations, AJC, Stand With Us, ADL, but he's also working with a lot of people outside of the Jewish community, like Pastor Carl Day, and a lot of different people from different ethnicities and religions. And often he's the public face for the Jewish Federation and the JCRC, and he presents our perspectives. And really, what I realize is so important right now is to build bridges. And he's really amazing. He and the organization that he leads in building bridges. So thank you, Jason, for everything that you're doing. And please take it from here.
Thank you, Yair. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and I appreciate you congratulating me. It's an honor to lead this work at this time. It's a historic moment for the Jewish people, and I'm proud every day that I get to do the work of combating anti-Semitism and representing our Jewish community in Philadelphia, which is the city that my grandparents chose to come to after surviving the Holocaust. So it is a tremendous honor. It's also an honor to be here this evening with our esteemed guests, Claire Finkelstein and Jonathan Schanzer. I always tell Jonathan that when I see him that I don't know if he remembers, but I remember being an undergrad myself and bringing Jonathan Schanzer to campus to brief us. And I've always been impressed by the work that he does. And of course, I'm impressed by Claire's work too. But it's always great to have these full circle moments of, remembering being an undergrad and looking up to Schanzer, and now getting to moderate a conversation like this together with Jonathan and Claire. So I'm just going to dive in and quickly read their bios, and then we're going to get to the nitty gritty of what we're here to discuss tonight. So starting with Claire, Claire Finkelstein is the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the founder and faculty director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute affiliated with Penn's Annenberg Public Policy Center, an expert in national security law, military ethics, and professional ethics. She has published widely and co-edits the Oxford Series in Ethics, National Security, and the Rule of Law. Finkelstein frequently advises Pentagon officials, Senate staff, and the JAG Corps on national security issues. She is also a regular media commentator with op-eds in outlets such as the New York Times, Washington Post, and Bloomberg News. Jonathan Schanzer is executive director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the author of State of Failure and Hamas versus Fatah, which is actually the book I brought him to speak about when he came to my campus. Previously, he served as a counterterrorism analyst at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where he helped designate terrorism financiers. Schanzer has held research positions at the Middle East Forum and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he is the author of Al-Qaeda's Armies. He holds degrees from Emory University, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and King's College London, and studied Arabic at the American University in Cairo. Schanzer frequently publishes in major media outlets, testifies before Congress, and appears on television as an expert on Middle East affairs. So we're very lucky to have Claire and Jonathan both here joining us tonight, taking time out of their precious schedules to really share their analysis with us of the current moment that we're in. And that's the question that I want to open up with for both Claire and Jonathan. So we hosted a briefing with the two of you, actually just with Jonathan last year, unfortunately, but it was supposed to be with the two of you. But last year when we hosted you, Jonathan, it was a little under a year ago. I think it was last May. It was a very scary state of affairs in the world, vicious encampments popping up on campuses nationwide, open anti-Semitism going on, much of it unchecked. And we were really in a moment where we felt like, things were getting totally out of control. Things some people will say have improved a little bit. I know that things have seemed to quiet down a bit, but we're definitely not out of the woods at all. And as we were just discussing, this is, we're moving towards a phase 2 of the war in Gaza. And so I want to ask both of you, where are we today? What are the trends that we're seeing? And where do you think things are going to go, both on campus and off campus throughout the United States of America? Whoever wants to take it? Jonathan or Claire?
I'm happy to start. I can give you some impressions that I got from a recent trip to Israel, and what I heard from friends when I was there. I've heard since in phone calls that I've had, and I think things appear to be sort of moving along the lines of what had been conveyed to me when I was there. The ceasefire deal was struck. And everybody was sort of cheering and happy to take a breather. It was interesting because the ceasefire deal was actually reached in a bipartisan fashion here. I mean, that's just incredibly rare. We had the Biden team still in charge, and we had Stephen Witkoff, the president's Middle East advisor, out in the region leading the talks, even though the Biden administration was still technically in charge. What they basically conveyed was that nobody wanted this war to continue, not at the end of the Biden administration, not at the beginning of the Trump administration. So they struck this ceasefire deal. The ceasefire deal was built in such a way that there would be 3 phases. The first, which we've just completed, is the women, children, elderly, sick, injured, in exchange for roughly 2,000 prisoners. And when that deal, when the first part of the deal is finished, or when it was supposed to be finished, then we'd move on to phase 2. Phase 2 would have would release the remaining men of fighting age. Those are the ones that are still right now in Hamas possession, in exchange for additional fighters released from Israeli prisons, Hamas fighters. But also, it would mean the end of the war. And that would mean Israel leaving Hamas in place. And when I spoke to some of the people who were involved in writing this deal, in negotiating it, they said, look, the thing that we got out of it, the thing that we're happy about, is that there are no guarantees of going into phase 2, that Israel could decide not to go into phase 2 and return to the war. That's the only way that Bibi Netanyahu is going to keep his coalition together. because his right-wing coalition would not have allowed for Hamas to stay in place. So it was sort of written already that we were going to arrive at the crossroads where we stand right now. Now, what's happened over the last couple of weeks, phase one ends, and Israel has basically told Hamas, with the support of the president, which is, I think, making this very interesting, said, look, we don't want to go to phase two, but we're willing to do phase 1.5. It's a very Israeli thing to say it's phase 1.5, right? So what they're saying is, look, we want to keep this thing going. We want to allow you to enjoy Ramadan without war. We'd like to enjoy Passover without war. So how about another 6 weeks of quiet? In exchange, we're going to flood the Gaza Strip with humanitarian assistance, food, medicine, other kinds of aid. In exchange, we get quiet and a few bodies up front and a few hostages released at the end. But you get to continue to be in control of the Gaza Strip until we can find some other solution. Hamas is saying no. The Qataris, the lead negotiators, are slamming the Israelis. It's interesting. The Saudis are slamming the Israelis over this. No one seems particularly happy about it. But if you read the president's post, and by the way, I don't read Truth Social, but I saw it appear on my Twitter feed, at least a snapshot of it. And he basically said Hamas needs to decide whether they want to live or die, which basically is, I think, where we all saw this. Now, and I'll try to wrap this up quickly, but Israel has a really interesting choice. Right now, it has the backing of the United States if it wants to go back in. I don't think Trump is saying no to Bibi right now. He's saying, you do what you need to do. But he's also not giving really a lot of advice. He's not giving guidance. He's not telling Bibi, here's what America prefers or doesn't prefer. He's basically saying, you're on your own. You have the weapons that you need. You have my political support, but you're on your own. Which is very different than the micromanagement that we saw from Biden, where they really tried to, get involved in every decision at every point along the way. And it was driving the Israelis crazy. But I think this is almost like Bibi being the dog that caught the mailman. He doesn't quite know what to do with this now that he's sitting with all this freedom of action. And he's looking at a weakened Iran. Their air defenses are down. He's looking at a Syria that's no longer under the thumb of Bashar al-Assad. He's looking at Hezbollah that's weak. I mean, he looks around the region. It looks like, hey, look, this doesn't look like there's that much risk. But I think that's deceiving. There's the war in Gaza, which, we continue to see Israeli soldiers fall as the fighting has gone on. That's one. But then there's the question also of how many fronts light back up if Israel goes into Gaza. They were fighting a 7-front war before. Now, I don't think Syria is going to light up again. I'm pretty sure Iraq's not going to light up again. Lebanon, probably not. I think Hezbollah is weak enough that they're not interested in another round. However, you have the West Bank, which has still been on fire for the last several months, and that could turn into something that looks like a second intifada or a third intifada, something like that. You have the Houthis, which is, I think, the big one, right? They have ballistic missiles and they are itching to fire more of them. And then you have Iran itself, which I think is a big question mark. They know they're vulnerable, but they also know that they have 2,000 ballistic missiles that they could fire at Israel. And that those could do quite a bit of damage to the Israelis because, quite frankly, we don't know how many interceptors the Israelis have for these ballistic missiles. So there is this fascinating crossroads, a bit scary because you could have a 3 or 4 front war just by reigniting the Gaza war. Now, the last thing that I'll say before I hand it over to Claire is then the question is, what does all of this do on campus? And I would argue that as we look around right now, you see a lot of campuses also starting to light up a little bit, right? You see a little bit more agitation. You see the kids coming out and maybe, being a bit more brazen, a little bit more willing to, engage in some of this behavior. Look, some of it's thumbing their nose at Donald Trump, who's now, threatening to crack down with Task Force 10-7 on all the anti-Semitism and radicalization that we've seen on college campuses. But I also think that this is very reminiscent of what happened in early October of 2023, where the students knew that war was coming. And I would argue that the organizers behind the campus activities, they're pretty plugged into Hamas world. And this is some of the research that I've done has indicated that that's very likely the case. So I think right now you may be watching a reanimation of the student movement in anticipation of a second round of war. I'm concerned about all of these things primarily because it's all unintended consequences. Nobody has any idea what comes once all of this starts. But I don't think that this is as simple as Israel just saying, yep, Hamas is weak, let's just sweep the leg. I think there are a lot of choices that may not be immediately apparent that Israel is currently wrestling with. And that may be why, even though the ceasefire has ended, that Israel has not gone rushing in. I'll leave it there and maybe I'll ask Claire to pick it up.
Okay, wonderful. This is such an excellent summary. And I think what I should do is focus more on domestic issues. And certainly Jonathan's knowledge of the Middle East situation far exceeds my own. So let me focus more on the campus issues. And I agree with Jonathan's assessment, and maybe I'll just sort of add a little bit of my own color to it. I mean, things have been relatively quiet on campus this academic year. I just came from an event at Hillel here at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was very pleased to hear that the students felt safe. They felt comfortable. They felt well supported, particularly by the Jewish community, which of course rallied in the previous academic year, and a lot of that infrastructure has held alumni, faculty, donors, a little bit from university administrators, not as much as we would like to see, and those structures are still in place. So with the relative quiet on campuses and the additional structures that we have from last year, I think Jewish students on campus are feeling a lot safer than they did. But I agree with Jonathan that there's an increase in activities. Just today, for example, there were a number of students arrested at Barnard. There were 50 NYPD officers in riot gear that appeared at Barnard because there was an occupation of the Milstein Center. There was a bomb threat. There were chants of a crowd in solidarity with the Barnard student, NYPD, KKK. They are all the same. And here's where I want to emphasize a shift from last year. And I think this is a very important kind of development. What we saw this during the encampments and post-encampment, which was a shift from a pro-Palestinian movement to a pro-terrorist movement. And it was quite marked, and I've been tracking this, and my center has been tracking this, the number of terrorist symbols cropping up, the number of pro-Hamas symbols, pro-Hezbollah, PFLP symbols, even Houthi rebel symbols, groups that are not united in anything other than their hatred of Jews and of Israel. And it's quite striking the degree to which students and outside agitators, and we don't know exactly how many are students, have been willing to move from a narrative that one can imagine is attractive to people, especially people who don't understand better, who don't see behind the scenes, which is the poor Palestinian people are being attacked by aggressive Israel, and Israel is exaggerating in the war and so on. This narrative that they are innocent civilians, and I'll say more about that in a little bit. So the general thing that one finds in war, where there is a concern about the lives of civilians, an understandable concern, to a real identification with terrorist organizations. And to put this in perspective, I mean, it's as though after 9/11, we would have seen people at demonstrations going around very soon after the 9/11 attacks, while people are still actively grieving their loved ones, or may not even know what have happened to their loved ones, with pro-Al-Qaeda signs, right? With and later with pro-ISIS signs. And we didn't really see that in this country, right? We didn't see that kind of identification with terrorist organizations. So why is that happening? Is that a spontaneous upswelling of support for these terrorist organizations? The answer is no, in my view. This is a radicalization of a certain segment of the population. And the question now is, how is that radicalization occurring? And here's where I might put a slightly different emphasis from Jonathan's, actually something that we've talked about before. I see it as more of a top-down movement than a bottom-up. I see it as coming more from faculty than from students. And why is that? Because to all outside appearances, it may seem as though it's a sort of spontaneous thing that's coming from students, but I think it's actually being carefully inculcated by faculty and outside individuals that are radicalizing our faculty, who in turn have an enormous impact on the students. And that our educational system is being systematically revised and co-opted, that people who really don't understand anything about the Middle East, I mean, really nothing at all, and could barely find Israel on a map, are being taught the most unbelievable lessons in the classroom by their professors, who they look up to and are convinced would never lie to them. And that when you get to a certain critical mass of faculty members who are all more or less saying the same thing, it's almost impossible for students to resist that messaging and to see it any other way. And what do we have on the other side? We have faculty members, and I count myself among them, who either do not wade into these debates in the classroom, or, and I teach law of armed conflict, when I talk about the situation in Gaza and I talk about the law of armed conflict and I talk about topics like, the utilization of civilians and civilian infrastructure for human shielding purposes and so on, I'm very, very careful to do it in a very neutral way that is not politicized, because I understand that to be the obligation of faculty members in the classroom, as opposed to in my own writings or in other contexts. And so this is a battle that goes on in universities that's very hard to fight on fair terms, because you have one side in the battle that's really seeking, that has an activist mindset in the classroom and is seeking to use the classroom as a kind of bully pulpit to radicalize or to convert students, that are teaching classes on resistance in the Arabic department, for example, teach and assigning original Hezbollah texts, we understand. That's just one example of something that we've heard. The students that imbibing that. So where is that coming from? Well, we're starting to piece together data and information that there are millions of dollars from Qatar that are pouring in, and a lot of those dollars are pouring in directly to faculty members, grants to faculty members, grants to students as well. There was a Qatar trust that you've probably all heard about, the Saudi trust. Now, it's very hard to connect causality. Can you prove that the millions of dollars flowing into universities from Qatar is having a causal impact on the views that people hold? It's very difficult to do that, but the Middle East centers, which have a certain orientation and so on, are very often receiving these funds, and it's a natural assumption to make that there would be that impact. So let me sort of stop there, and I'm sure that we'll discuss that further as we talk.
This is fascinating. So what you're saying, actually had a question for Jonathan, but you brought something that I want to talk about right away. Basically, the money is coming from Qatar or from wherever, and spilled into all the faculty that are basically encouraging the brainwash, the resistance, all of that, all all the radicalization. And the question that I have is a little bit difficult to discuss it because, on none of our webinars, we never go into politics. We never go into Israeli politics nor American politics. But we can't ignore the fact that in the last few months, there has been a change in administration. Many people, especially within the Jews, were hoping that this will change something, that the fact that, his new administration will be harsher on DEI, harsher on education, harsher. There's been a lot of investigations in healthcare, for example, Johns Hopkins, whatnot, harsher and harder coming down on anybody who supports terrorists, especially if they're not from here, they'll be deported, all of that things that we're seeing. And the hope is that maybe all the hate that we see that is emerging and coming from the faculties or from the campuses will somehow, I don't know if die off, but certainly people will be like, okay, I need to back up a little bit and see what happens. I don't want to be eliminated from the university, etc. How come we're not seeing it? If anything, in the last few weeks, more.
I'll give my view on this, and then I'd love to hear what Jonathan has to say. But I think the Trump administration has a number of different priorities. And it's my view that the importance that it assigns to reducing anti-Semitism on campus is very far from its highest priority. And I think a number of its goals may actually end up being self-contradictory. So I'll just give one very important example in this area. It's very hard to force universities to meet their obligations under Title VI if you eliminate the Department of Education, that more or less is the instrumentality of ensuring that campus meet these obligations and gives guidance, and for years has produced the Dear Colleague letters and the other sources of guidance for university administrators. So right now, university administrators are lost because they're terrified of losing federal funding, but only based on statements that have been made, not real guidance. So if the Trump administration is really serious about eliminating anti-Semitism on university campuses, and I desperately hope that they are, they will keep the Department of Education, because this department is critically important to provide systematic guidance to universities on how exactly to do that. Another example is that I just wrote about this morning. I published a piece this morning in War on the Rocks about a program in the Pentagon called the Civilian Harm Mitigation and Reduction Plan. And that plan is very important because it teaches us how to assess casualty rates among human shields. Right, so we have to be able to identify who is responsible for the death of civilians when we're fighting an enemy, when Israel is fighting an enemy, for example, that makes widespread use of civilians as human shields. And there are different kinds of human shields, and there are different kinds of situations, and we need to be able to have a very sophisticated and complex metric for identifying whose responsibility it is when there are civilian deaths in a context like that. And the primary program in the Pentagon that was able to provide those metrics is on the chopping block and is about to be eliminated, along with other cuts. So if you cut in this very, very broad and broad-brushed way without making nuanced distinctions among things that should be saved, you may sort of be throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
So I think I'm going to be a little bit more optimistic, which is really not my style. I'm my wife calls me Dr. Doom, and I think for a reason. But look, I would say that we're 6 weeks into this administration. It's a little bit early to declare this effort dead. I mean, look, I think there's plenty of reason to say that the Trump administration has lots of other priorities. They do. We've got to leave lots of time to insult allies and drive people crazy. I mean, we've got a lot on the list, right? I am kidding. I mean, I see both sides of that particular Oval Office spat. But let me put it this way. I think that, wait, first of all, no, I don't think we should dismantle the Department of Education. However, they have not done a particularly good job in dictating what happens either at the higher ed level or in K through 12. And I think they need to be gutted. I don't know if they need to be shut down. I'd like to see something remain and then build back in a way that would help maybe oversee foreign money that's coming in, give, directives to universities about what is acceptable and what is not, what will trigger a cut in foreign in federal funding, what won't. Things like that, I think, would be useful. And so I tend to agree with Claire that, chucking the Department of Education would probably be a bad idea. But, engaging in serious reform, which, by the way, would take a lot of effort, right? Actually deciding what is worthy and what is not, separating, baby from bathwater, so to speak, or cutting fat while not cutting muscle or bone. These are things that I'm not sure anybody is particularly well equipped to do right now in the current matrix. You either have holdovers from from the Biden administration, or as we would call them, people from the deep state that have no interest necessarily in jumping on with this new initiative from the Trump team, and then you've got Trump folks who are operating at a senior level, and they haven't had time to start to assign the political, the political folks at the assistant secretary and deputy assistant secretary and senior advisor levels, the worker bees at the end of the day, the people that are going to get this stuff done. But, as for the crackdown on violence and intimidation and hate speech and things that are unlawful on American college campuses, that's where I think I'm more sanguine. And the reason why is because, look, having worked in the federal government, having worked in this space, give or take, what I know is that things move slowly. That's in the DNA of the federal government. There is nobody I know in the federal government that is able to move quickly. It's just right. I always tell people about my initial experiences in the federal government. My first day on the job, my boss told me, I'll never forget it, and I never forgave him for it. He said, nobody ever got in trouble in government for doing too little. And I lost my mind. No, I really I could not get my head wrapped around this. And, then a couple months later, I'm doing work with the FBI, and a guy tells me, he said, there's an old adage here you need to understand. Big case, big problem. Small case, small problem. No case, no problem. And this is the mentality that we're dealing with. So if what we're watching right now is an effort by the Trump administration to ramp up investigations into what's been happening on the schools and to hold the schools accountable, it's going to take time. We have to light a fire under the bureaucrats who are not used to working at the speed of Trump, right? They're looking on and they're watching him issue 100 executive orders, and their heads are spinning. They don't know how to process this in bureaucratic terms. What I can tell you anecdotally, though, is the folks that I've talked to in federal law enforcement, things have changed. That whereas during the Biden years, there was an effort at the beginning to really start to look at this problem, and then the political pressure began to mount from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party or from within elements of kind of the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And what happened is all that work slowed to a crawl. And that's where it stayed for the last 4 to 6 months, maybe longer. And now what you're seeing is the lighting of these fires again. And they're going to take a little time to warm up before they start to, kind of burn the tuchus of the people that they're under. So my suspicion is that over the next 2 to 3 months, we're probably going to see some action. I'm not going to say that it's going to scratch every itch that everybody has here on the call, because I think we'd like to see sweeping action. Not sure that's how it's going to work, but I will also just tell you that anecdotally, I am aware of federal law enforcement starting to reach out to schools and actually talking to them. So anecdotally, I feel good. Systemically, I know we're dealing with the federal government, and who knows where that takes us. But I'm not entirely pessimistic here tonight, which surprises even me.
Well, so I've heard that as well. I've heard those reports as well, and I share the encouragement, especially around what basically is counterterrorism operations, and the sense that we're not just going to sit back and tolerate the presence of terrorists on campus anymore. And some of that was present in the State of the Union address. But if I look at the priorities of the Justice Department, I have to say that I think it's whatever her prior record was on anti-Semitism, and I understand it's pretty strong. Pam Bondi is much more concerned about getting Jeffrey Epstein's flight records than she is on prosecuting people who have, who are associated with Hamas terrorism or other forms of terrorism, at least at present. And maybe it's because that's an easy, quick win. But if you look at Donald Trump's priorities, anything that touches him personally is going to be a much higher priority. So solidifying power against those who have spoken out against him, or who have acted against him, who have tried to prosecute him, who have investigated him, is his number one priority. And that leaves something that is a reflection of pure value, which is defending Jewish life, and defending against prejudice against Jews in this country, as fundamentally a lower priority, which is something that comes from his commitment to his donors and to his political backing, his base. And I think I agree, it takes time, it'll bubble along. But I'm also concerned about another factor I'll just mention, which is the overshooting the mark factor with dramatic statements that don't come through. So the suggestion of deporting campus activists, when I heard that, even I sort of, got my hackles up and thought, wait a second, what are we talking about here? So the sense that we're going to be doing this in a way that observes the rule of law, that can be defended according to all legal precedents, in a way that allows Jewish life to be defended and Jewish safety to be defended on equal terms that we give to others who've been attacked on campus. That's what we want to see. And that's what's very, very hard to establish in a system that seems, almost sort of random and where we don't have norms and metrics and standards that are being evolved and developed and enforced in a very consistent and predictable way.
Thank you. I want to take this in a little bit of a different direction. You've both given us so much to chew on and so much to digest. As Yair said, we had over 250 people sign up for this webinar. This topic is very hot in the Jewish community right now. People are very concerned about the situation on campus, and especially hearing about the foreign funding that is behind some of this really nasty anti-Semitic activity. So I'm wondering if you both have any recommendations. What are the tools that we can use that are effective to start pushing back against some of these both domestic and foreign actors? Are there legal tools that we can put into play, a Title VI, a FARA, something else? Is it letter writing campaigns? Because I agree with Jonathan, I agree with you. We all know that things take time, especially when we're reliant on our government. Government bureaucracy will extend the time of things quite a bit. So what are the tools that people in our community have right now that they can start to employ to start taking action against some of these bad actors that are fostering this horrible activity on our campuses?
Well, there's one, I'm looking it up just to make sure I know how to, here it is. It's called the Deterrent Act. It's a piece of legislation that's currently winding its way through Congress. Defending Education Transparency and Ending Rogue Regimes Engaging in Nefarious Transactions Act. It's a mouthful. That's the Deterrent Act. what it's going to do, hopefully if it passes, is actually begin to either forbid foreign funding from certain actors in higher ed and actually even K through 12, but also force disclosure. This, I think, is probably the biggest missing piece when you look right now at what has been happening on campus. I mean, I do think that there's a stewardship issue within the university system, and we can talk about that, but they're not being held to account. And part of that, we were talking about Department of Education. They were supposed to be tracking every transaction from a foreign actor above, I want to say it was $250,000. I think deterrent is going to drop it to 100 or even 50K. So in other words, you are just not going to have, oh, thank you for popping that up there. That's the one. You're just not going to have this free for all any longer. And so I would keep tabs on this bill. It didn't pass last time. It didn't get through the Senate. I think this time around, just given the matrix, the makeup of Congress, I think it's more likely to pass. And, you know, what I think we're beginning to learn, and it's actually fascinating for me. We've been doing some work on, I still believe that Qatar is probably one of the worst actors here in this space. This is a country, for those who don't know a lot about it, most people don't know a lot about Qatar, but it's a country, it's smaller than Delaware. It's got 330,000 people. It controls 12% of the world's energy, and it has basically bottomless wealth. And we've been tracking the amount of money that's gone into the United States from Qatar. It's estimated that they've invested something like 10 or $20 billion into just higher ed. We know that there's money that's going into K through 12 in professional education, professional training of teachers, and in some cases just meeting shortfalls within within various school districts. This is the kind of thing that cannot continue. We, of course, know that the Chinese are doing this, the Russians are doing it, but I think the Qataris, as it relates to the anti-Semitism that we're seeing, I think they set the level here. And so I think deterrent is going to be huge. I think FARA could be huge. This is the Foreign Agents Registration Act. There is, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I think the enforcement of it has been abused over the years, and it's been, applied in ways that have made a lot of people in Washington more comfortable, less comfortable. Let's set that aside for a minute. But, no one has actually applied the Foreign Agents Registration Act to universities. And if you're taking massive amounts of money from a foreign actor, that makes you a foreign agent, even if you're a university. And then you should have to disclose. So that's another area. I don't know how active FARA is going to be, but I think there's something interesting in there. But for me, I got to say, just getting a number, and this is a big part of what we're trying to do at FDD right now, 10 to $20 billion in our university system invested by the Qataris. To what end? I mean, this is the question we all have to start asking ourselves here. What does this incredibly wealthy country, an autocratic dictatorship that supports Hamas and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood, why are they putting so much money in our education system? What is it that they want? I don't think it's our liberal values that they're trying to cultivate here. There's something else that's going on. And then, so broaden it out, and you try to get a sense of what's happening on each of the campuses where we've seen anti-Semitism skyrocket, and you try to draw a correlation to the Qatari money. Now, some people are going to say the Qataris are funding this. I think that is difficult to assert. I cannot prove that. I can't say that I know that the Qataris are put X amount of dollars at Cornell or Penn or Georgetown or whatever, and that this is all, the result of the Qataris wanting this to take place. I think what has happened here is that the Qataris have obviated the need for traditional alumni networks. It used to be that people like us, we'd give $500, $1,000, $5,000, $50,000, whatever the amount was. But it was our community that helped shape the values of every school, right? The administration would take the money and they'd say, well, what do you you care about? And they would, kind of collect the input that they were getting from alumni, and they would set agendas. And what I think what happened over the years was they began to realize, administrators and fundraisers began to realize, hell, we don't have to go around from one house to the next and spend all this time out on the road and, spend time away from our families and exhaust ourselves. We could just go to one place, hop on a plane, right? Probably get a first class ticket because they invite us. Head out there, stay in a 5-star hotel, offer them whatever it is. Hey, we'll create a campus in Doha for you if you just give us $10 million. And then anti-Semitism breaks out on your campus after 10/7. And you're like, you know what? I don't know if I really care about all of these alumni who are howling, because so what if they decide to pull their $5,000 check? I get a $10 million one waiting for me in Doha, and they don't care about anti-Semitism. And by the way, neither do our professors. That's how this, I think, starts to take shape. But I do think if you're able to start to reduce the amount of money, foreign money, which should never have been in our schools in the first place, I think you can begin to chip away at this problem. But this is the kind of thing that will take years, not weeks.
So I will put a similar spin on it, but maybe fill the details in a little bit differently. So this is a massive disinformation campaign. And disinformation is increasingly part of warfare. It's how wars are fought now. There's a reason why on October 7th, 2023, Hamas attackers and other attackers were wearing GoPros, because in most wars, of course, the war strategy makes use of disinformation, makes use of psychological warfare to advance the aims of the war. But in this case, the combat and the attacks are themselves part of a sophisticated media operation. And so there's a reversal of the normal order of things, in which the kinetic warfare is actually part of a worldwide media strategy to turn the world against Israel. And so you can think of what's going on campuses as one tail of that enormous operation. It's not a different thing, it's the same thing. And so what you do is you find different ways, financial, psychological, social media. We shouldn't overly focus on the finances, because yeah, they're absolutely critical. But if we were to be able to do a detailed causal analysis, I think the finance would be only one piece of it. I think there are chains of influence and control, loose command and control networks that tie in campus actors in various ways that we don't understand completely. And Jonathan's work has been critical to exposing some of this from many years ago. I think his work really started to open this up in ways that nobody had seen before, and was certainly an eye-opener to me. So I think that's part of the problem, is that we are living out one piece of this gigantic Middle East struggle, which has spilled over to university campuses. And then we've got these traditional concepts of free speech, First Amendment rights, open expression, that makes campuses sort of sitting ducks, along with the Black Lives Matter movement and things that culturally sustain and support this way of thinking, and the weird fusion also between gay and trans rights, and the idea that somehow Palestinian, I will absolutely never understand that connection. So there are cultural factors that make universities very fertile ground for this kind of disinformation strategy. Now, Farah is very, very important. And my center has been doing a lot of work in this space, as Jonathan and I have talked about before, because FARA is a statute that comes from the 1930s that Congress originally passed to counter Nazi and communist propaganda. And so you would think that it could play a very important role here, because it's actually a statute designed to protect U.S. national security against the kind of foreign propaganda that we're seeing here. Interestingly, the Saudis and the Qataris fought a very, very multi-year battle over FARA itself to try to force Al Jazeera to register under FARA. Millions of dollars were spent by the Saudis and the UAE to try to force Al Jazeera to register, with U.S. PR firms and law firms getting involved in this battle. In the end, the UAE and the Saudis won, and the Justice Department stepped up and said that Al Jazeera had to register, but that's never been enforced. And so, in fact, they never were, in the end, forced to register. So it's interesting how these Middle East battles then get fought over the very concept of FARA itself in the U.S. system. It's sort of like, what is American law doing, wasting its time fighting battles between Middle East countries, right? But I think that shows you how this is all spilling over from those Middle East politics. So ultimately, the key to this will be shifting the culture. And one of the worries that I have about the way that the Trump administration intersects here is that the recent alignment of the Trump administration with Russia and the pro-Israel stance sort of will cause people to associate Israel with Russia, right, with the bad guys. And that equation has been made before. There's so much opposition to the Trump administration that's coming out right now. There's so much concern. There's so much talk in the military about increasing lethality. It plays exactly the wrong way as far as changing that culture and convincing people to support Israel and convincing people to turn away from anti-Semitism on campuses. Ultimately, to change that fertile ground of culture, we educators need to do a better job of changing our campus culture, and we need to do a better job of educating our students and our colleagues. And we're right now getting we should be getting a failing grade. I don't know, I think the ADL was generous to Penn and to other universities. I think we got upgraded to a C this year. But I think the idea of campus neutrality, not making any statements, which is the way that universities are going to get themselves off the hot seat, is exactly the wrong direction to go in, because neutrality means the maintenance of this kind of toxic culture. We have to do a better job of teaching our students, teaching them about anti-Semitism, teaching them about the Middle East, teaching them about this system of disinformation, and exposing to them what it means when they are waving Hezbollah flags around. And we also need to forbid that on campus. I mean, there is no reason that any university, however much open expression rights they give to pro-Palestinian demonstrations, there is absolutely no reason why any university administrator needs to tolerate terrorist symbols on campus and terrorist speech on campus. Those are absolutely distinguishable, and it can be forbidden, and universities need to come with clearer rules, clearer restrictions. That's the only way we're going to change the culture.
Thank you, both of you. This was fascinating. My next question, and just a reminder, we're gonna have a hard stop to respect everybody's times and our speakers at 9:15 Eastern time, so it's about 21 more minutes. So we're gonna start soon with more questions from the audience, and I appreciate those who also texted us individually. My next question is to Jonathan, aka Dr. Doom. So Dr. Doom, before the question, I wanted to just say something about what you said about Qatar. Indeed, it's really, really scary because Qatar are, transferring billions of dollars to the university. And of course, they're not innocent. I mean, there's no doubt that the Qatar are the one who transferred hundreds of millions, if not more, to the Hamas to build the tunnels that they infiltrated, the money, the weapons, their strategy, the training, the leadership. It is all the Qatar, the channel that went from Qatar to the Hamas and other terrorist organizations, as you mentioned. So there's no doubt that the money that is being transferred here to our faculty, to our universities, it has some sort of a malintention. My concern personally is that even if we do the federal, like you said, it's bureaucracy, and it's going to take a long time until all these laws, eventually they're fast. They'll find that another way. Maybe they'll if it's not going to be the traditional way, they'll find other ways to transfer the money. That's what of course my concern is. But anyway, back to the question. What is feeding everything and what fed everything before, the campus violence and everything, is the war. And what you said before we started, Jonathan, is that you're expecting, or you just visited Israel, and you think that there's a very good chance that the war, even though it's now ceasefire and people are, we're releasing prisoners and they're returning our hostages in horrible condition and dead, of course. But it looks like things are quiet, but you're expecting good chance that this is going to escalate again. Is there another scenario that maybe because of all the, United States, but also Egypt and Saudi Arabia and maybe other forces, somehow something will happen and Hamas will be not eliminated, but removed as instead of the Palestinian Authority in terms of control, and maybe there's not going to be a war?
Look, I think we're all still exploring that right now. I'm not particularly optimistic, because Dr. Doom would typically not be. Again, primarily because I think Israel understands that if it leaves Hamas in Gaza, it's lost the war in many ways. At least that's how Israel is going to look at it. And so that's why I think we're very likely heading back there. Now, there are still off-ramps. The first one is phase 1.5, as I was describing it, right? Which is, everybody agrees to stop fighting for another 6 weeks. I would love that, because I got to say my schedule's opened up quite a bit since January. Just not having to follow the war, not feeling like it's this crushing, terrible thing that's happening across the ocean, and having zero impact on the trajectory. It's been a miserable thing, I think, for all of us to watch. So I would certainly welcome even a postponement of a return to war for another 6 weeks. And I think it's possible, and that will come from political pressure from the Trump administration, maybe from Europe, maybe from Saudi, maybe from Qatar itself, if they're feeling enough squeeze from the U.S. and from others. But again, I think right now, if you ask me, both sides know what's coming, and they're not done. I mean, both sides actually still have fight left in them. I happen to think that Hamas will not last this second round. I think phase 2 is the last phase for Hamas. That happens to be my assessment, unless somehow Iran and its proxies do more damage to Israel than I think they're capable of. So I think Hamas would be smart to wait and hold off. I don't know if they've reached that conclusion themselves, but more time to prepare and more time to just buy time, I think, would probably be in their interest. They're not looking at it that way. Again, for Bibi, the political clock is ticking. His right-wing coalition does not want him to give Hamas the breather. He doesn't want them they don't want him to give Hamas an out. They're saying, look, you already have them weakened. You've got all of the axis weakened. Go in and finish the job. That's why we're in the coalition with you. That's why this wartime coalition is held. Now, those are the sort of two main options. It's like defer, and then there's the war now. But either way, you're getting to war. What you raised, Yair, is kind of the last option. And here, this is like, you're down the rabbit hole. Trump's plan, if we can call it that, when Bibi came to the White House, Gaza-Lago, as we like to call it, right? It was not a real plan. There's no plan. There was nothing. There was no meat on the bone. There was no specifics, right? what he basically did is he tore a page out of Art of the Deal. If you read his book, you'll know that part of his negotiation tactics is to basically float something that is absolutely unacceptable to the other side. And they go crazy, but eventually he says, look, you don't like it, come back and tell me something else, right? Like, give me something that I can work with. And that's actually where the negotiation begins. It's actually really smart, right? I mean, I'm not saying that the president understands the Middle East. I'm not saying he understands a lot of things, but in this, he actually did the right thing because he floated this thing. Everybody went apoplectic. And now what you are watching is the Egyptians just came up with a plan. They released it yesterday. I don't want to say that it works because it doesn't, but it was $53 billion that the Arab world would spend on reconstruction over 5 years in Gaza. It will not turn it into Club Med, but it would turn it into something that would be livable. The problem that we've reached right now is that the deal does not solve for Hamas. Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, neither are acceptable to the Israelis, would not be allowed in for 6 months. But then after that, there is no limit to what either actor could do in the Gaza Strip, thereby returning us to where we were on October 6th, give or take. So the question right now is whether Trump can continue through just dropping bombs in the Arab world, freaking everybody out, calling for the forced transfer of Gazans, calling for Jordan to take in refugees, calling for Egypt to take all these things that are putting people's turbans on fire in the Middle East right now. You do that some more, and maybe you get to a solution that everyone agrees upon. Now, I say everyone, it's not everyone, because Hamas will disagree. And if you have the right solution, which is Hamas leaves the Gaza Strip and can never come back, Hamas won't be happy, Iran won't be happy, maybe a few others won't be happy, but this would be the way forward. And I'll just be honest, I don't think anybody knows what Trump's negotiation strategy is here. He's doing mineral deals with Ukraine. He's dropping, these crazy, ideas in the Middle East. It's chaos. I don't know where this fits in within his priority matrix right now. I don't know how much he's going to be able to push this forward. I mentioned before about the bureaucracy. He's got good senior people right now. He's got a good Secretary of State. He's got a good national security advisor. He's got a good senior director at the National Security Council in the Middle East. I know and have worked with all of these people, and I think they're very competent, but there is nobody below them right now to help keep this process going. And that's what worries me. You've got a handful of people that are trying to drive this process, and pushing back against them are way more people. And that's the concern I have. But just bottom line, Yair, there is an off-ramp. I just don't know how to assess the likelihood of success for this off-ramp. I think nobody can.
So let me just add something to this, which is, I think I'm a little bit more Mr. Doom or Ms. Doom than even Jonathan.
I think you're Professor Doom.
I'm Professor Doom because I don't see this round 2 as getting rid of Hamas, because they're not just located in Gaza. They're in the West Bank, they're in Lebanon, they're in South America, right? So, and
they're on your campus.
They're on my campus, right? Exactly. And so it's really impossible to think, and because the problem isn't just Hamas, it's the radicalization of the entire population in Gaza and a comparable population in the West Bank and elsewhere and throughout the Arab world. So we have a profound culture of seeing Israel as the enemy. We have a profound culture of intermixing of civilian and militant populations. That is that's a point that I can't emphasize enough, that when we talk in the law of armed conflict about civilians who are directly participating in hostilities, it sounds awful to say, but in war, we're used to being able to rely on the principle of distinction and the distinction between civilians and combatants. And here we just can't rely on that because we've got an enormous population which is incredibly intermixed with a terrorist organization. And so we can't even identify Hamas very clearly because we have Hamas proper, and like Al-Qaeda and AQAP, Al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula, we have a whole civilian network that is there to support Hamas and Hamas activities, and that really can't imagine life without Hamas and without weapons under children's beds and in kindergartens and in schools, broadly speaking, and in mosques. And so how do you get the militancy out and away from the civilian population, not just in Gaza and the West Bank, but in Lebanon and all over the Middle East? That's, again, a cultural matter. I don't know how you do it, and there was a lot of mocking by Trump in the State of the Union address and Republicans in the run-up to that address of Sesame Street, the Arab Sesame Street. But yeah, I had never heard of that program until there was an interest in cutting it. But I thought, actually, that's a pretty good idea. I love Sesame Street, right? It might actually, but these things are very slow, right? That's a very huge, slow boat to turn. And the idea of trying to change a culture, which is a culture that is unfortunately pointed towards terroristic activities, is a very, very difficult thing to do.
Thank you. We're going to take a couple of audience questions and try to wrap this up by 9:15. So I'm going to bundle two of them together. Karen Feynman asked, says, Jonathan says more fire campus prevention with the feds under Trump, whereas Claire says sudden increase in radicalization on campus. Is there a relationship between the two? Maybe more extreme response by the US threatens radicals funded by Qatar. And Deborah Glazer said, Qatar influence. Please speak about Witkoff and Jared Kushner's business dealings with Qatar. Bondi also did legal work for them.
Look, there are a lot of people who talk about the folks in this administration that have been influenced by the Qataris, shall we say. Jared Kushner has business partners in Qatar. Stephen Witkoff had Qatari business partners for his hotel in New York. Pam Bondi was working with Qataris. Kash Patel, the head of the FBI, also Qatari contracts. Lee Zeldin, head of the EPA, Qatari contracts. It's a lot. But I got to tell you, it's not that different than, I mean, if we went back, I think, into the Biden administration, you'd find probably roughly the same. I hate to say it. The Qataris, again, they spend a massive amount of money in this country. All right, 20 billion or so in higher ed. But I mean, every white shoe law firm in Washington is under contract. Every lobby firm in Washington is under contract. Every PR firm. It's unbelievable the depths of the Qatari money that is sloshing around in this town. The congressional baseball game every year, guess who sponsors it? When the Caps went to the Stanley Cup finals, guess who kept the Metro open after midnight? It's insane how much money is sloshing around here. And so I'm not shocked by any of it. I'd like to end it. We're working on that. I think that I wouldn't look at that as an indicator of Qatari influence per se. You got to hope that the guardrails within the U.S. system would be such that, if there were things that were happening that were illegal or counter to American interests, that they would be challenged. But it's going to take some work. I wish we could just kind of wave a magic wand and get all of this out of here. But when they have that much money and they've been buying influence for as long as they have, it's tough. Look, there are people, by the way, who've gone down for this. Senator Menendez, if you read that story, right? I mean, the guy got gold bars from Egypt and Qatar This is what brought him down at the end of the day. So the wheels of justice do turn, even against the Qataris, but we're going to have to do a lot more work here. And again, I'm hoping that the Deterrent Act is a big part of this. Maybe FARA will be part of it, but there need to be other tools that we have, whether it's Department of Education or just flat out investigations by the Treasury Department. I mean, the term that we use, by the way, in political science is state capture. And I would actually argue that we're on our way if we're not careful, right? If you look at a country like South Africa, people have been, their hair's on fire about the South Africans bringing Israel to the ICJ and all this other stuff that's been going on over there. If you could look it up, the country of South Africa a bunch of years ago was exposed. They had been essentially bought out by a crime family, the Gupta crime family. If you look up the Gupta papers, you will see this insane story about South Africa. And so when you look at what the government is doing, it's actually not doing it on its own volition. It's doing it because someone else is pulling the strings, and that's a crime family based in India. So we need to be careful that doesn't happen. And again, part of it, I think, may boil down to exposing the sheer amount of money that has been invested here, and then starting to ask questions as to why all of that money has been invested here. And that's FARA, it's deterrent, it's all these other measures that we talked about.
So let me be really clear on this. If you have an administration that tosses out all the conflict of interest rules, state capture is going to happen. There's no way to avoid it. And it's not just Qatar. Okay, so let's look what happened to Mayor Adams. Okay, Mayor Adams of New York City had extensive dealings with Turkey. And he arranged a number of city contracts for Turkey. They bought him all sorts of plane tickets and other benefits. He had an indictment a mile long, and he was on his way to prison. He was the luckiest guy in the world. Probably that there was no Democrat who was as happy that Donald Trump was elected than Mayor Adams, because he had a relationship with Donald Trump and Trump sprang him. What's really important is normally in the executive branch, when you come into a position in the executive branch, you need to divest from your holdings. You get a certificate of divestiture. You have to clear your conflicts. You cannot be invested in specific stocks, even domestic stocks, and you absolutely cannot take money from foreign governments. And for even the first Trump administration had a functioning OGE, Office of Government Ethics. This is the first administration that basically has a non-functional OGE that has not insisted on any kind of deconfliction of personal assets. On the contrary, they're seeming as though having personal financial entanglements, and especially with foreign governments, might even be a criterion for some of these jobs. So the problem with Qatar is a problem also with Turkey, with the Saudis, with the UAE, with many, many Middle Eastern countries, with Russia, Tulsi Gabbard, right? So we have to insist, this issue has to be depoliticized. It can't be that we want the Qataris out of our schools and out of our government just because we're concerned about Israel. It's got to be because that is not the way government or universities should be run in this country. They should be free from all foreign influence. It should be on objective, neutral, rule of law grounds. And unfortunately, it's this administration is not going to let us cut through to that.
Okay, so it is exactly 9:15, and I said that we're going to finalize or finish this session on time. Honestly, there's so many questions that we haven't answered, and I have a million questions. Jason has a million questions. We can continue this conversation for an hour. So really, thank you, Claire. Thank you, Jonathan, so much. Thank you, Jason, for your help arranging this, and congratulations again for your appointment of being the chief of the JCRC in Philadelphia today. This is great news. and I'm very happy for you. And yeah, this has been great, and the feedback, as always, is amazing. And thank you for all that you are doing. The recording will be available in the next few days. We will send it to everybody who registered and also on the WhatsApp groups. So any last comments, everybody? Anybody?
Yair, thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you for having us.
Toda rabba. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you,
Laila tov.
Jonathan. Thank you, Yair.
Thanks, guys.
Good night.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.